Chat with Two Rabbis. Thank you for being here tonight. It's Tuesday. It's March 19th. No, what's today? March 16th, 2021. And I thank you. I hope everyone's having a good week. And I'd like to introduce our Rabbi Barry Silver, who everyone knows, our rabbi and spiritual leader of L'Dor Va-Dor, our guest rabbi, who we're just thrilled to have as part of this, Rabbi Zvi Kahn, Orthodox rabbi and educator, and we are thrilled to have both of you on and speaking to us about the Torah, about Jewish things, Israel, etc., and looking forward to hearing more about the Leviticus Parsha, the first one. So thank you very much, and take it away, gentlemen.
All right. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you very much, Sharon, for launching this program once again and for spearheading all of these great discussions. And I thank everyone for being on the line. I thank everyone here for participating in these discussions. This particular passage, I'm sorry to disappoint Sharon. I know she loves to hear all the details about the passage, but you probably wouldn't want to hear too many of the details about this one. It's pretty grisly, unless you're really into like the body parts of cows after they've been slaughtered and how you should deal with them. And it's pretty grisly. I have some things I'll say about the passage, but I will probably defer to Rabbi Kahn, who's more into the animal sacrifices and that kind of stuff. probably knows a few more of the details that I quickly skip over. In fact, I was just talking to Ari today, and Ari was really excited because he's at University of Florida, and he was told that a neuroscientist wants him to help with research, and he was really excited about that because he's a freshman, so it's doesn't happen that often. But he told me that they're going to deal with rats, and I said I knew I smelled a rat in this somewhere. And he said that they're going to have to kill the rats after they do their tests. They're going to have to kill the rats, and he won't kill rats. He doesn't believe in it. And I raised him to be concerned about animals, and I said I really respect and admire him. I think you have to do it on a case-by-case basis and see what the experiment is trying to do and whether it's really worth the pain and suffering they're putting the rats through. But this passage is troubling. It talks a lot about animal sacrifices and blood being splattered all about. I'll just say this. Judaism has always evolved, and the principle behind Leviticus is a very good one. It's trying to restore our souls and get into the good graces of powers that are greater than ourselves, and trying to give up something that is ours in order to make amends and become purified. This is a very, very good impulse in the Jewish people. But we evolve, fortunately. Fortunately, we're not still going around slaughtering animals. A prophet named Micah came around, and he said, God doesn't want all dead animals and your slaughtering and your bulls and your goats. He was kind of bullish on loving mercy and doing justice and walking humbly with thy God. And I'm really glad to see that Judaism has evolved. And but like I say, the principle behind va-yikra and the Torah is a good one. And it's also good that we continue to grow and figure out better and better ways to try to achieve spiritual enlightenment. Rabbi Kahn, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Great to see everybody. Just a quick anecdote of my son, the one who lives in Israel, arrived today before to celebrate the Passover holiday with us. He's the one who made Aliyah, my older boy, Avi, and my son Shmuel was on briefly, I think, last time. And so having two sons here, they said to me, come on, Dad, we got to go out. And I said, no, tonight's a special night. Tonight's Tuesday night with my friends. And I realized it sounded like I must be part of a bowling league or something like that. He said, okay, what are you doing with your friends? I said, tonight is L'Dor Va-Dor's weekly get-together. So I just want to share with everyone that I really look forward to our get-togethers and being a part of the group. And I want to thank Rabbi Silver and Sharon and all of you, each and every one of you, because you're regulars. I recognize the names now, and I recognize everybody pretty much. And so thank you for having me, welcoming me into the group. And I always look forward to our discussions and our conversations. So thank you.
Rabbi Khan, do your sons know who you're consorting with? Have you told them?
They know. Well, Shmuel, as I said, was part of the last group, and and I explained the group to Avi, and they're both all for it. My boy, and Rena's been on too. One of my three daughters. So
yeah, Rena's great.
They all believe that Jewish people getting together, like I said last week, Jewish people getting together to talk about the Torah cannot be a bad thing. Cannot be a good thing. So, as Rabbi Silver foreshadowed for us, this week's Torah portion of va-yikra actually begins the whole third book of the Torah, which is also called va-yikra or Leviticus, and it does deal a lot with sacrifices. Not all of the sacrifices were in the temple that were brought in the Jerusalem temples were animal sacrifices. They did have something called in Hebrew a mincha, which was a meal or a flour offering. It was based. It was made with flour and oil but most of the sacrifices were in fact animal sacrifices, sometimes animals, sometimes birds. And there's absolutely no doubt that that whole concept, that entire concept is very out of sync, to say the least, with modern sensibilities, in modern times. And we're now living in a period about 2,000 years after the destruction of the second temple, which happened in the year 70 CE. And that was the last of the sacrifices brought by the Jewish people at that time. So we're living in a time when that's a foreign concept and a very, very difficult concept to understand, and a very challenging one. And of course, there's been lots of rabbis and scholars discussing why did they used to do that? What was the purpose of it? What did it symbolize? What was the meaning of it? And I'll just really share one thought on that. The word in Hebrew for a sacrifice is a korban, and it comes from the root, which karov or karav, which means to come close. And the concept behind korbanot in general, the concept behind sacrifices in general, was to come close to God, for people, for human beings to be able to find a way to come close to God and to create a closeness and a bond there. And that was the motivation, and that was the concept behind it. And again, as Rabbi Silver mentioned, there were all different kinds of sacrifices, and they had all different kinds of rules and procedures, but that was the underlying theme. Some sacrifices were brought to celebrate joyous occasions and as a way of expressing thanksgiving. Some sacrifices were brought if a person did something that was considered a sin, and it was a way of gaining atonement, again, as Rabbi Silver alluded to. And so there's no doubt that when we study this week's Torah portion, and also several of the ones coming up, although there will be other ideas, themes, and concept and commandments mixed in at different times, sacrifices will be inside of the Torah portion itself. Sacrifices will often be discussed. So I always like, in my own mind, just to go back to that kind of word, the root word of sacrifice in Hebrew, of karov, and the idea that they were motivated to get close to God. Once the temple was destroyed, the services that took place in the temple were no longer carried out. However, prayer came to the fore, which doesn't mean to say that prayer services did not take place before. They certainly did. But the idea of having formal prayer services and congregational prayer services 3 times a day, the morning prayer service, the afternoon, and the evening, really came into their own, so to speak, after the services in the temple ended with the destruction of the temple, again, about 2,000 years ago. So just some little thoughts to share there. And with that, I'll turn it back to Rabbi Silver.
Thank you, Rabbi Khan. The sacrificial system, like everything else in the Torah, like you say, Rabbi Khan, it's very, very hard to understand. if you believe that this was written by God. And it's even more difficult than we've suggested. The Torah also says in va-yikra that the reason why you do the sacrifice is because the sacrifice has a pleasing odor to God. This is called Anthropomorphism, where ancient people thought God was like a human being, just on a bigger scale, like a big human being in the sky. And therefore, he needed to consume food in order to live. And so the sacrifice turned into smoke, and then God consumed the smoke, and he would live. So this is even more difficult to understand if you take it literally. Like, how could a dead animal's smoke be pleasing to God, and he's actually inhaling it? Once you rid yourself of this concept that God wrote it, then it becomes exceptionally easy to understand. All primitive, well, not all, but in that part of the world, people were sacrificing animals. That was the thing to do. It wasn't God's idea, it was a human being's idea. It's a human concept. All people were doing it, and the Jews were doing it too. So the Jews borrowed their religion from the surrounding cultures. But to their credit, the Jewish people outgrew it, and they stopped sacrificing animals. The problem is that other groups haven't outgrown it. So for instance, I was at the mosque with Ari one day, and they were having a big celebration. They were really thrilled. I said, "What's going on?" "One of our members just had a baby boy, and we're celebrating. We sacrificed 2 goats. So I said, "Really? What happens if it's a baby girl?" They said, "Well, then we sacrifice 1 goat." So I said, "I guess those ghosts are hoping for girls." And our sacrificial system, that we didn't really bring it to the world, we just codified it in the Bible, which other people interpreted as God's word, then became picked up by other groups. And so even today, you have Muslims slaughtering innocent animals because they think God wants it, whereas they'd be better off nutritionally, health-wise, and the environment would be better if they gave up this practice. Then you also have the Christians. The Christians not only accepted sacrifice, they doubled down on it. And they said, we're going to have an ultimate sacrifice to satisfy God's bloodlust. An animal's not going to do it. We're going to use a human being. And we're going to make it his son. So now his son's going to be sacrificed. And by the way, even though it's part of God's plan, it's the Jews' fault. So we're blamed for killing Jesus, even though God came up with the idea and we're just carrying out some plan, according to Christian scripture, which, by the way, is not true and is spreading blood libels against Jews. So this concept that we've inflicted upon the world about a God who has a bloodlust for animals is rather unsavory. And I think we have an obligation to correct the record so that the daughter faiths can also not be inflicted with this concept. However, like Rabbi Khan and I were saying, there's a lot of good things about this. I share his appreciation for the fact that sacrifice is called korban, meaning to come closer. And I think Micah got even closer still by saying killing animals isn't good, but all God wants is to walk humbly with your God, to do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Now we're getting even closer. And then we get up to a guy named Spinoza, one of the greatest Jewish minds who ever lived, who was, of course, excommunicated because he's a little too smart. And he conceived that you don't walk with God, that God isn't even an entity, that God is a force that exists in the world, that exists within us, which concept was also picked up by Einstein. So now we're getting even closer. So the sacrifice is a Latin word. Sacri is related to sacred. Fais is related to, in Spanish, hacer, or to make. It means to make holy. So how do we make ourselves holy today? How can we achieve holiness today? Not by slaughtering an animal, but by getting rid of or killing off the bad instincts within us, the evilness within us, the hate, the arrogance, the intolerance, the anger. We have the capacity to achieve holiness. All we have to do is rid ourselves of these bad influences, and really good things will come out. And we'll also be able to be at one with the greatest spirit within us that's within us all. This spirit is not out there, it's in here. One other thing I'll mention about va-yikra, which I'll probably also do on Shabbat, because I'm putting together the Shabbat service, so I don't want to make it anticlimactic, but you get to hear it first. You've probably heard me say this before. Va-yikra is a Hebrew word. It comes from, the verb is koreh. Koreh means to read, or also to call out. And it's related to the word Quran, which is a document that was read or called out. Quran and Koreh remind us that Muslims and Jews are very, very close, and we need to remind each other about that and try to bring ourselves closer to our brothers and sisters. And also the Pope issued a call today, and he said that the worst thing about the pandemic would be if we suffered this pandemic and learned nothing from it. That would be the ultimate tragedy. And I actually mentioned that last Passover, and I'll be mentioning that again. And so we need to come back out of this pandemic to realize that the problems that plague humanity affect all of us, and the cause affects all of us. We can't wipe it out in one country, not in the others. And the solution to a lot of these problems is science and a respect for science. With that, I would love to turn it over to other people. I've been told, it's hard to believe, that sometimes I have monopolized the conversation. And so I will try to refrain from this ill by sacrificing my desire to keep talking. And I will turn this over now to others to share some of your insights.
Can I ask a quick question, please, to both of the rabbis? I waited all day to ask this question. Barry, and I spoke to a woman who is she owns the one of the all-state agencies that I have my car insurance with, and she's Orthodox. And she said to me, "Am I ready for Passover?" And I said, "You know, my name is Pesach." And she says, "No, it isn't." And she asked her husband. Of course, her husband is Orthodox too. So now I have the perfect opportunity to ask both rabbis. My name is Peter. Ever since I was bar mitzvah, I was under the idea that my Hebrew name is Pesach. Am I right, or was I misled?
Did you have a baby naming and a bris? Did you have that experience?
Oh, sure. I had a bris. Sure.
At that time, were you given a Hebrew name?
Oh, gee, your guess is as good as mine. I don't know, but yeah.
But on your bar mitzvah, you were given a Hebrew name of Pesach. That was
I believe so, right? That's why it stuck with me, and that's why I could easily say that's my Hebrew name. But she said, and her husband verified it, that it was like a Simon. My Hebrew name is like in the vicinity of Simon. Didn't make sense to me.
Yeah, well, no, your Hebrew name is whatever Hebrew name you're given. It would be that's the type of chutzpah or arrogance for someone to say, your name's not really Peter. I'll tell you what your name is. Your Hebrew name is whatever Hebrew name you were given. Now there is a reference in Christian scripture to Simon Peter.
Oh my God.
But Peter normally, a Hebrew name for Peter would normally not be Simon. Let me just explain though that Peter is a word that means the rock.
Correct. I know that. Yes.
And it comes from the Greek.
Correct.
But your Hebrew name is whatever your Hebrew name was designated by your parents. They decide, not somebody else. Rabbi Khan, what's your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. There are many times where the English name a child is given, a baby is given, is connected to the Hebrew in some way. So Peter with a P and Pesach, or Pesach with that same first sound is very, very common. I had a good friend in high school whose English name was Paul, and he was a Pesach. And as the Rabbi Silver said, you are a Pesach. So don't.
Good. Thank you.
You got nothing to worry about.
Yeah,
That's a great name.
what, this was the perfect opportunity. I had two rabbis I could ask this to, not one.
If you have it confirmed by an Orthodox rabbi and by me, and we're both agreeing on it, then you can probably take that to the bank.
Exactly.
I couldn't feel better. Okay.
And it's a great name also. Pesach is a great name. Passover is the Freedom Festival, and it's a great name. Go ahead, Sharon.
Thanks, Barry. All right.
I was just going to say, my father-in-law, Olav Shalom's name was Philip, and his Hebrew name was Pesach, and they called him Pacey. I didn't even know his name was Philip. We called him Pacey all the time, Pesach. And and he was a beautiful person, and I always remember him. So Peter, be proud that your name is Pesach.
Very good. All right, who else? Who else wants to share something?
Well, I wanted to, if I may, I liked both of your points about va-yikra, and I especially like what Rabbi shared about how to achieve holiness and how to, in today's world, and you're not going to sacrifice something, but how can you achieve that? I think that's a really good thought process to for each person to consider. How can I be a holy person? How can I be a better person in today's living? I just wanted to ask a question about the sacrifices. I know Rabbi Barry alluded to other groups, and I think we know that many other groups, ancient groups such as the Mayans and many groups in South Africa, in Africa, and maybe in South America, Central America, they did human sacrifices. And I think that was possibly before the 2,000 years ago. I don't know. I don't know exactly chronologically how that timeline comes, but you alluded, Rabbi Barry, that we might have copied the animal sacrifices from other groups, or they copied it from us. I can't remember exactly how you said that, but I just can't see doing a human sacrifice. That to me would be the ultimate horrible thing, but it's bad enough to do an animal sacrifice, but a human sacrifice.
You see, we're looking at it through modern eyes. We have to put ourselves in their mindset and see the world as they did. So a storm would come, a flood, a plague, a pandemic, a nation would come in and wipe them out. All types of things were going on around them. They had no clue why. They had no idea what a disease was. The only thing they could figure is that somebody's really mad, somebody's really angry, and somebody's unleashing these forces. These gods could unleash forces on them because they were mad and they were scared and they didn't know what to do. So they figured, okay, apparently these forces want to kill people. They want people to die because they're mad. So the best thing we can do to satisfy and appease them is to give them what they want, which is a human being, and kill them. Well, who would you find to do that? Who would you kill in order to satisfy the God? Well, not one of your own. So you would go and conquer other people in a war they're your enemies, and you'd sacrifice them. Or maybe you might sacrifice a child who hasn't yet grown up yet, or maybe the child is completely weak and defenseless. You might sacrifice a child, or you sacrifice like your enemies. So this to us seems barbaric, but when we understand their sensibilities, it starts to make sense. Later on, they hoped or thought or believed that maybe the gods would be satisfied with an animal. The Jewish people, the sacrifice that the Jews engaged in clearly was part of a cultural-wide practice that was going on thousands of years ago. You can see it in Greek mythology. You can see it in Egyptian, you can see it in all types of mythology, and they were all doing it. But the Jewish people rebelled against it with Micah, who specifically said, God doesn't want this. He wants you to change your heart. And what do we sacrifice today? You'll notice that I saw a beautiful cat here. If someone were to slaughter their cat and give it up, that wouldn't make them happy. That would be horrible. But what we can do, we can sacrifice some of our time and help somebody. We can sacrifice some of our money and give to a good cause. We can sacrifice some of our knowledge and share it with other people. We find that when we do that, it makes us feel holy and special, especially if it's for a good cause, especially if we do it with other people. That is a way that we can achieve holiness and elevate ourselves. By the way, va-yikra is also called Leviticus. And Leviticus is related to the Levites, but I like to think it means to levitate, to lift ourselves up to a higher level through sacrificing things that we have that we can share with others. Go ahead, Emily.
Okay, you know, I walk in the morning with a bunch of women. Some are Jewish, some are not. And we were talking today about Judaism's way of slaughtering animals, because one of the women's grandmother was a butcher, and you know, she explained about how the chickens had to be killed humanely, et cetera, and that how this was, of course, this whole thing offended the vegetarian among us. However, the whole idea was that Jewish people were eating meat, but they still felt that they should be killed in a humane way. Am I right, Rabbi Khan? So there's all those rules about how animals have to be killed so that they're not in pain. At least this is how
Yes,
my grandmother.
one of the concepts behind slaughtering
Yeah.
in Judaism is that it should happen as quickly as possible and as painlessly as possible. As a matter of fact, the knife that is used by the slaughterer, if a nick or a tear or something, a break is found in the knife after the slaughtering is done, it would render the animal not kosher, because a nick or a break in the knife would mean that it wasn't done as smoothly, as quickly, as painlessly as possible. So you're absolutely on target. Yes.
Yeah, I agree with Rabbi Khan that the Jewish people have been evolving ever since earliest days. If you look at Leviticus, and I painstakingly read through the whole chapter, the methodology used for the slaughtering in Leviticus is not, it's not a pretty sight, and it's not a pleasant thing whatsoever. But I will say this, that as Jewish people evolved, they became very troubled by this whole concept, and they eventually gave it up. And what you're saying, Emily, is exactly right. Not in the Torah necessarily. You don't necessarily find it in the Torah, but you find it in Jewish writings as Jews evolved, Talmud and other places, that the methodology of slaughter, exactly as Rabbi Khan says, was try to make it more humane. My take is that if you want to apply that principle of Judaism, of continuing to evolve, to become more and more humane, and trying to move past some of the cruelty of the past, then a vegetarian diet would make sense, or at least not eating animals that were slaughtered in a slaughterhouse and raised in really filthy, disgusting, horrible ways. This is not good. And I would suggest perhaps that the coronavirus, which we believe came out of the Chinese wet market, which is really barbaric, perhaps is, if you believe in a divine justice, a divine justice against humanity for just allowing this type of thing to go on at such a wide scale. It's just, human beings have unleashed lots of terror and horror, and we should know better. Other animals do it by instinct. We are the only animals in the world that actually can understand the suffering that we inflict and do it anyway. A lion doesn't have that capacity. We do, and therefore we should be held to a higher standard, I would say. Rabbi Khan, I have a question for you. So the Orthodox don't engage in animal sacrifice anymore, even though the Torah says that it's a eternal law. There's a law for all time. When I've asked Orthodox rabbis to explain it, I got an answer that made no sense to me. So I'll pose it to you, but I'll give you the benefit of hearing their answers so you can see if you would concur with that or if you have a different explanation. It's very, very rare that I actually engage in a debate with Orthodox rabbis, and here I choose not to engage in debates because I think it kind of gets a little bit adversarial. But when I did, I asked the rabbi, why don't Orthodox people slaughter animals anymore and sacrifice animals? He said, well, it's very simple. There's no temple. You know, the temple was destroyed and the animal sacrifice came to an end because the Bible says that these sacrifices should happen in a certain place, which is the temple. And I said, well, that sounds good, except when Moses was telling people that they should sacrifice animals and carrying out, there was no temple. There was no temple in the desert. The temple hadn't been built yet. And not only that, it doesn't say in these passages like Leviticus, it has to be done in a temple. It couldn't have said it because there was no temple. So the next explanation I heard is, well, they didn't have a temple, but they had a little sanctuary there, and that was a holy place. And we don't have it anymore. But I mean, you can create a sanctuary, and the Torah doesn't say this is an eternal covenant as long as you got a sanctuary around, but otherwise it's not. It's just pretty blanket. This is an eternal covenant. But Orthodox don't do it anymore. My thinking is they don't do it because Judaism evolved and we realized it was wrong. But the Orthodox can't really say that because God can't evolve. God has to be a perfect being. So if he ordained it, it must have been right then. It must be right now. And a lot of Orthodox believe that in the end of days, we'll be doing it in Messianic times. We'll be going back and sacrificing animals all over again. So I guess it's twofold. What reason do you know of, Rabbi Kahn, for not sacrificing animals today? And when in Messianic times, do you think that we will be sacrificing animals once again?
Okay, so the answer that they gave you is very well founded. There are many verses actually that connect sacrifices, and many verses in the Torah that connect sacrifices to the original temple, which was the movable temple that the Jews did have in the wilderness. And that was, we've talked about before, in Hebrew, the Mishkan or the tabernacle. And that's viewed as a forerunner, kind of a early model of the temple that was ultimately built in Jerusalem. And then that came in two iterations. The first temple, which was around for a long time, and then it was destroyed by the Babylonians. And then the second temple, the temple was rebuilt. And so there was an edifice called the Second Temple. And then that was around for a long time and destroyed by the Romans. But the concept, again, based on Torah verses and Torah, is that sacrifices should only be brought in those locations, in the Mishkan, in this movable temple or movable sanctuary, and then later on in the temple itself. And sacrifices were brought all the way up until the temple was destroyed. The Second Temple was destroyed, and then they were no longer able to be brought, which then segues into your next question, which is, in Orthodox belief, is it the concept that once in Messianic times and the temple is rebuilt, and which will be referred to as the third temple, and once that's done, will sacrifices be brought? And the answer is yes. And I understand as I say that of course is an extremely difficult thing for people to understand and a very disturbing thing. I think I understand how people would find that to be very disturbing and very and have a really hard time understanding that. But there's, that's absolutely in line with the Orthodox understanding of Jewish law and the Torah.
Do you believe it?
Do I believe that when the Messiah comes and the temple is rebuilt, there will be sacrifices?
Yeah, animal sacrifices, yeah.
Well, from an Orthodox viewpoint, the only way that could change, hypothetically, would be if when the Messiah comes, that individual says that there's a new, a message from God that says not to do that. And that itself is not so, that's a controversial issue as to what authority the Messiah will have in order to make those kinds of changes. Now, the Talmud does talk about certain things changing in the future, in the Messianic time, and things will be different in certain ways, including areas of Jewish law will change. And so one might say hypothetically that possibility exists, but that's not, we'd have to wait and see. It would be a game time decision.
Why not emulate Moses? Moses got God to change his mind. God was about to destroy all the Jewish people, and Moses says, hey, wait a minute, that's not a good idea. And God backed off and said, hey, you're right, I don't think I would. Why wouldn't the Orthodox be clamoring and praying to God that he not do that? And tell God, hey, that's not such a cool thing to do, you know, and maybe he would back off.
Well, there's a fundamental difference between something that is a commandment, a mitzvah in Hebrew, where it specifically says in the Torah, this is what people should do, and a case like the one that you mentioned with Moses, where God says to Moses, I'm thinking of, or I might do X or Y. And Moses says, no, 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 don't do that. Even if you're offering to make me a new nation, as we had discussed back a few portions ago, Moses was put in a position to be able to say to God, if that's your proposal, God, if you're suggesting something to me, please don't do that. In a similar way to the story with Abraham, the wonderful story where God says, I'm going to wipe out the very evil, terrible people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham says, please don't do that. Now, in that case, God did carry out that proposal or his idea that he shared with Abraham, and those people were destroyed. But there's a difference, a fundamental important difference between commandments and between things that in the Torah God might have said, I might do X or Y, and then prayer or other things might have resulted in those things not happening.
What about Micah? Micah changed things around and said, God doesn't want your sacrifices. He said, all he wants is for you to sacrifice your heart. And it seemed like he changed what God had said in the Torah. Is that right? Or do you think that he had no authority to do it?
Well, let me say two things. The first thing is that a very important principle in Jewish law, or starting in the Talmud and becoming incorporated to Jewish law, is that prophets after the Torah, prophets who lived after the time of the Torah, have no authority to change things that are written in the Torah. So therefore, which brings up very interesting questions when one studies various chapters, incidents with, for example, with Elijah and Mount Carmel. There are different incidents that happen where it looks like a prophet is changing something, at least temporarily or for a specific situation. But the general rule is that prophets cannot abrogate the laws of the Torah, no matter how great the person is, no matter what the circumstances are, that can't happen. And then in terms of your question about Micah, there's a different reading of text, and Micah's not the only one where there seems to be this idea of not bringing sacrifices, but the reading is not a blanket condemnation of sacrifices, but rather bringing sacrifices when a person is leading an unjust life, leading a life without compassion, leading a cruel life, being cruel to different, people, the poor, widows, orphans, whatever the case may be, or bringing sacrifices in a way that is not in consonance with the rest of a person's life, that the prophets were saying that is not acceptable to God. God doesn't want a person to say, I can lead any kind of life I want and be unethical and be immoral and be irreligious, and then bring a sacrifice and everything's going to be fine. And so the reading is and along those kinds of lines, as opposed to a reading that says, oh, Micah came along and abrogated sacrifices. That second reading is not something that's not the way we read those texts.
Well, that's not the way the Orthodox read the text.
That's what I mean. I'm speaking all along from an Orthodox perspective. That when I say we, I don't mean the Jewish people. I don't mean Jews. I'm just, because you asked me, so I'm answering.
You do a great job of explaining the Orthodox position. I definitely commend you on it. By the way, from my perspective, the Torah was changed all over the place. Luckily for me, because the Torah says you should stone a disrespectful child, and I had my moments. I was doing okay, but I don't know if I would have survived that. Go ahead, Harris.
What about Judaism and gay marriage?
Go ahead, Rabbi Khan. I want to hear what the Orthodox think about that.
And my daughter is gay. Okay.
Well, Harris, it does say in the Torah that if a man sleeps with another man, they should be stoned to death. But fortunately, like I say, the Torah is not carried out anymore. The Orthodox find ways around it they're pretty ingenious. I give them credit for that. So they don't, I don't know. I don't think they stone homosexuals anymore. The problem is that the Muslim fanatics take the very barbaric passages from Jewish scripture and actually carry them out. They do stone homosexuals, and they do really grisly things to women if they're not a virgin upon marriage. And they take a lot of our stuff and then apply it literally. They don't have the benefit of Orthodox rabbis who are good at finding ways around it. But go ahead, Rabbi Khan. What should happen to a man who lies with another man?
Okay.
Should he be stoned?
Well, that wasn't Harris's question, but just as an aside, I don't think any Muslim would tell you that the reason, if it isn't a country like Iran, let's say, where they might carry out death penalties for homosexuality, I don't think they would base that on the Torah or anything to do with Judaism. They obviously base it on the Quran and their understanding of the Quran. Scholars might say, oh, well, the Quran has roots in Judaism, but that's a whole interesting, different question. But
it definitely does. The similarities are almost word for word identical,
and the differences are extremely striking as well. But my point is that the Muslim authorities, again, who carry out death penalties, which has not happened in Judaism, as I've mentioned one before, since the destruction of the temple or a little bit thereafter, are not doing it because of anything that's written in the Torah directly. They might say, well, indirectly, the Quran is based on, different point. Harris, the answer is that the modern denominations of Judaism have very different protocols in terms of a gay marriage. In Orthodoxy, it is not done. You won't find an Orthodox practice rabbis marrying two men or two women. I'm not 100% sure in conservative, but I think they do, and Reform and progressive groups certainly do. So that's and that itself is a very sensitive subject. One thing I can tell you that I've been very happy to see within Orthodoxy is more and more rabbis promulgating the idea, which I think is just vital and essential, and that is that whatever we feel as Orthodox Jews, as Orthodox rabbis, that are rituals and what we feel about Jewish law, whatever we're following, we can never lose sight of the humanity of all people, all human beings, and therefore we have to show respect and dignity to all human beings, whatever their practices might be, in the same way that we would never go up to a person and say, you did X thing wrong, and therefore I don't have to respect you or treat you with kindness. So too, we're not allowed to go up to a gay person and say, oh, I think you're doing something wrong, and therefore you don't deserve dignity and respect. Now, again, a person might say, well, if you really respect me, then marry, perform the marriage, and then you're crossing over from respect and kindness and basic human dignity, you might say, to something that within Orthodoxy is not viewed as an appropriate action. But more and more rabbis are speaking to their congregations about that and sending out letters. And having worked in the field of Jewish education, it's a very delicate and sensitive subject in Jewish schools and Orthodox Jewish schools, how to handle these discussions with students, especially high school students as they get older, college age students and things like that. So I'm just happy to see there's a lot more respect and dignity being given to people in that sense. But I'm being upfront about the fact that the marriages are not performed by Orthodox rabbis.
Rabbi Khan, just to help out Harris here, I think, I could be wrong, but I think that the Torah is really down on men sleeping with other men. It doesn't really have much to say about women sleeping with women. I think this gives away the fact that it was written by men. Men found the practice of men sleeping with other men, at least some of them found it abhorrent. But women sleeping with other women, they probably didn't really bother them too much. Maybe they'd want to be involved, who knows? But I don't think they found that to be quite as abhorrent. They don't seem to have an issue with women sleeping with other women. Also, their views on adultery were rather interesting, let us say. Adultery seemed to be a crime because you were like taking over somebody else's property. Like if you sleeping with somebody's wife, it's like you committed a crime against the guy's property. But if you were a man and you were sleeping with a woman, if you were married and you were sleeping with a woman who wasn't married, I don't think I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but to an Orthodox mind of the Torah, that's not considered adultery. Right? There are guys sleeping around with women, as long as they're not married to anybody. And even if the guy's married, it's not adultery. It might not be a cool thing to do, but it's not adultery, right?
In the Torah, a man could have more than one wife. Polygamy was allowed in the Torah. And certainly we have examples of many figures in the Torah having more than one wife. So that of course is not modern practice, but so therefore the idea that if a man was married, he couldn't be with another woman wouldn't make sense, because he could actually marry another woman. He could have two wives, or he could.
But he didn't have to. He didn't have to marry her. He could just sleep around with women all over the place, and he didn't have to marry them.
No,
right?
so
It's not adultery. But it's not adultery, right?
It's not. It's not considered adultery, but it is considered a sin. The idea that a man would just sleep with women wantonly without any kind of consecration of their relationship was considered a violation of harlotry, of almost like being with a prostitute. And so there are other verses as well that tell us that that's forbidden. However, a man could be with a woman, and again, according to Torah law, I'm not talking about anything after Torah law, but in Torah law, a man could marry more than one wife, or he could have a wife and have what we would call, what in English translations are called a concubine, or a type of wife. There were certain arrangements that were made, but both of those have relationships and legal standing, as opposed to just a man saying, I'm going to just, go out to bars and each night be with a different woman. That was not allowed by the Torah.
Yeah, why did polygamy go out of style for the Orthodox? Why was that? In
around the year 1000 CE, a great Torah leader of that time who lived in Europe, in Western Europe, named Rabbeinu Gershom, issued an edict that said that men should no longer marry more than one wife, and the feeling was that to do so would make Jews to continue the practice, would make Jews be doing something that was not at all in line with the way that societies around them were living. Now rabbis at any period of time, no matter how great, no matter how scholarly, cannot abrogate laws in the sense of allowing something that the Torah says is forbidden, but they can do what would happen in this case, which is to say something that is permitted, I am saying we should no longer do it, even though it's permitted by the Torah. And that's, again, a very important distinction. So this Rabbi Gershon, as great as he was, couldn't, for example, say, the Torah has dietary laws, and I don't think that fits in with modern society, so no more kosher, no more dietary laws. That would not be with any person's purview. However, to be able to say the Torah allows something, but I am saying that I think we should no longer do that thing that is allowed to us, that was considered, it's very rare that happens, but that's considered within the purview of a rabbi, again, who's kind of the leader of the generation or the leader of the people.
How can a rabbi change God's law? How does that work? I mean, the rabbi, God's saying that polygamy is okay, he has no issues with it. And then some rabbi comes along and says, well, I don't care what God says, I'm telling you, you can't do it.
Well, I don't think the way he phrased it was, I don't care what God says. I think his phrasing was probably a little bit more
respectful,
a little bit different. Again,
a little more rabbinic.
The idea is that we're not obligated to do any of the things that the Torah says we're allowed to do. And as you correctly pointed out, no one was obligated to marry a second wife, even in the time of the Torah, right? Moses married Tzipporah, and that's it. That was his wife for his entire lifetime. Abraham was married, on the other hand, Abraham married Sarah, and then at a certain point also married a woman named Hagar. And so we see both of those models, men married to one woman, a man married to two women in the Torah. But the Torah never obligated people to marry more than one wife. So what was happening in this case that we're referring to when polygamy was banned was the rabbinic leader, along with other rabbis, said, we don't have to do anything that the Torah allows us to do. It's just, we have a choice. Do we want to do it? Do we not want to do it? For example, in all the kosher laws, it never forbids artichokes, just as an example, because I enjoyed stuffed artichokes today for lunch. But just to use that example, but you're not obligated to eat artichokes. And if for some reason the rabbi said, you know what, artichokes have lots of, I'm just making this up, artichokes have lots of bugs in them and we shouldn't eat them, that would be within his authority to do. And that sometimes happens in different places in the world where they say you shouldn't eat a certain thing, even though it's always been kosher, because of a certain problem or a certain situation that comes up. Again, the key point is what the Torah allows us to do, we're allowed to not do, to refrain from doing. Of course, I think that's logical and obvious. We don't have to do it. were just allowed to do it. And then that's what took place with polygamy, which was obviously a much, much bigger decision than outlawing artichokes, but it was a very big deal. And I should point out that in the Sephardic world, in some countries, for example, Yemen and some parts of North Africa, when Rabbeinu Gershon in about the year 1000 made this ban, they didn't accept it. And they said, well, you don't have the authority to do this for our communities. You can do it for your Ashkenazi European communities. And they continued to practice polygamy. And there were Yemenite families as in modern times up through the 1950s that practiced polygamy. And then once the Yemenite community was brought to Israel, it's illegal to have more than one wife there. And so that was pretty much the end of polygamy within Judaism.
Yeah, it's called too much of a good thing.
I think we have a couple of questions. I know Emily has her hand raised, but Valerie had her hand raised about 20 minutes ago. So I want to give Valerie the opportunity, Valerie and Mishka, to say something, and then Emily.
See, I can exercise restraint when I really have to. I will say before I make my statement, just to let everybody know, this is Mishka's birthday today.
Hey, happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Mishka today is 90.
Wow, mazel tov. That's a big milestone. Wow, congratulations, mazel tov.
Mazel tov.
Mazel tov.
What I was about to say, I think, thank you. We were going back to what was talked about earlier as far as how can we change certain ways people live. And there is sacrifice even in contemporary times in America. It's called voodoo. In the Louisiana area, there are factions of the Louisiana culture, the original culture of the French African combo that still to this day practice voodoo and animal sacrifice. So it still is very, very prevalent in the United States, in many areas. Even I believe in some areas the Wicca also do that, have sacrifice. So it is not something that really has disappeared into the past. It's still quite relevant. And I think and I think the only way that we can change people's perception and people's way of doing things is not necessarily through Judaism per se, but through education and through societal changes, in general. That's really how things evolve and change. But there are always going to be factions that revert back to their ancestral habits. And I don't think we have the ability to change that. Yeah,
there was a celebrated case in the Supreme Court where the Santeria sect was slaughtering animals.
Exactly.
And down in Miami, they thought that was barbaric. So there's a case. Did they have it was a religious ceremony. Did they have the right to practice their religion? Or does the state have the right to say, we don't care if it's your religion, this is barbaric, we're not going to allow it. And unfortunately, they were allowed to do it. They were allowed to do it. That was considered their religious practice, and they stay. And part of the argument that the Santerias made was that, hey, it's in the Torah. I mean, it's not like this is some bizarre idea. This is something that's part of Western civilization. It's in the Torah. Just because they don't want to do it anymore doesn't mean we shouldn't be able to do it. And they also said, most people go around slaughtering animals all day long in slaughterhouses. The animals are slaughtered all the time. So why should we be picked on? We're doing it for a religious purpose. Animals are being slaughtered every day. So what are we doing that's any different? And they prevailed. Mishka, now that you're 90, you want to share some of your wisdom after your 90 years with us and give us the benefit of your vast experience?
Well, let me just say, as one who has been teaching constitutional and international law, and with the oncoming changes that the Biden administration wants to incorporate, that universities were the forerunners of integration in many, many ways. In my own case, I have 3 people that are administrative above me. 2 of them are African-American ladies, and 1 is, I'm not sure, transgender person. So, you talk about how changes have come about almost automatically. you know, and you have to deal with it. And by the way, in Biden's, some of the laws that he's interested in, or his administration is, they are recognizing transgenders in the sex that they currently have. So that changes a whole lot of things. That's it. And my wife bought dinner tonight.
What a great idea.
Very good. Yeah. Go ahead,
So in other
Emily.
words, they always used to
I
have
just
to.
want to say that,
Go ahead, Valerie. Let
the
Valerie
other-
just finish up.
I was just saying that up until now, you had to identify as a gender on your birth certificate. And what Mishka was referring to is now they're trying to move to recognize how you're living your life as opposed to the gender that was on your birth certificate.
That's very interesting. Right.
That's what's going on right now.
Right. That's good. Go ahead, Emily.
Well, you know, I think the whole sacrifice thing to get you in God's favor has morphed into Catholicism and confession, kind of. You go to confession and you rid yourself of your sins and you're all better. It's a bit more humane than slaughtering a cow, but it's the same kind of thing, you know. Dear Father, forgive me, I murdered someone. 3 Hail Marys and 4 whatever, and you're fine. And I think, you know, that's a bit more humane. It's still a little weird. Just my opinion. The other thing is, remember, there are societies that had polygamy where a woman could have more than one husband, which I thought was very enlightened. And so just leave it at that.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, when the Catholic Church has confession, the only reason why it works is because they believe that Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice. So you have no ability to confess and be forgiven unless you've accepted the ultimate human sacrifice of Jesus. Yeah.
So,
anybody else?
Rabbi Khan, I believe your father, I think Saul, had his hand raised. Is that true?
I'm not sure how well he's hearing us. Dad, would you like to say something?
He's not muted, but we can barely hear him.
Subject to discuss, but it was very enlightening to me who sat here and listened to it. It was very, very, not only entertaining, it was very enlightening, and I learned a lot from it already tonight. Thank you.
Fantastic. That's great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saul. I have to say, it's a pleasure to have you and your son on.
Especially when you talked about stuffed artichoke.
I was remiss. My dad made the stuffed artichokes, and what he wanted to make sure I mentioned. They're delicious. It's an old New Orleans recipe, and he does a great job with it. So thank you, Dad, for lunch and for your comments.
What are they stuffed with?
I'm gonna, if he hears
Bacon.
you, I'm going to tell you. Dad, what are you stuffed the artichokes with?
I think it's stuffed with bacon, isn't it?
No.
Parmesan cheese and olive oil.
Parmesan cheese, breadcrumbs, olive oil, and some spices.
Oh, wow.
That's good.
It's
Nice.
really good. It's really good.
Wow.
Very good.
Wow, that sounds great.
All right. Well, we've been on for an hour.
Yes.
Anybody want to
Anyone
wrap
else
this
want to
up?
share anything? Yeah, this has been a great discussion this evening. Very interesting.
Yeah, this is
I have
very good.
one thing to do before we leave, though. Don't go away. Don't go away.
I think
Hold
Valerie
on.
wanted to squeeze in a last thought.
I want
ahead.
to show you one thing.
Okay.
Can you see it?
Very nice. I like
Happy
it.
birthday,
Great.
Mishka.
That's
Thank
great.
you.
Very good.
Hey, Mishka.
Very nice. Now, I will mention one thing before we close out. You know, it's uncharacteristic of me not to mention anything political, but I just want to tell you something. I went to Guatemala. I was at a wedding. The grandparents of the groom were sitting right across from me at their table, spewing all types of pro-Trump stuff, and really, and a lot of anti-Biden things. And I was very, very well behaved and restrained. I listened politely. I raised a few questions, but I was very polite. And by the time I was done, they said, we can't talk about Trump anymore because this other person who's at our table, he's one of those Biden people, and we can't talk in front of him. So let's just all talk about Trump now before he comes back. It's like I was like one of them, and I felt good, like I was getting an inside scoop on how others think. It was pretty interesting, but I was uncharacteristically restrained. But I will just say one thing in this broadcast and in this Zoom. I was really thrilled to see Deb Haaland nominated for the and appointed to the head of the Department of the Interior. I think that the first Native American, and maybe after doing so much carnage, we can start to turn around. Maybe there's a turning point in our country, and we can learn to live that the earth doesn't belong to us. We belong to the earth, and we need to learn to live in harmony with it. So I think this is a good thing. Anyway, this is a great conversation with everybody. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. Sharon for running this, Rabbi Khan for doing such a wonderful job of putting up with all my questions and sharing the wisdom of orthodoxy, and your father for letting us all know about artichokes. I think he made us all hungry now. We're all going to go out and have artichokes. And thank you, everybody, for participating.
Happy birthday, Mishka.
And also Saturday. Saturday is going to be really good. Saturday we're outside. We're going to be at John Prince Park at Smythe Pavilion. We're going to have some really cool music, and we're going to be together. So see if you can make it out there. It's going to be really, really good. Thanks, everybody.
Safely together. Bring your chair, bring your food donations, and bring your mask.